Huge thanks to our sponsors for making ResolveCon 24 possible. Motion VFX makes the best plugins for DaVinci Resolve. They have plugins to quickly add beautiful graphics to any kind of project you're working on, and they're compatible with both Mac and Windows. And right now you can get their mHello 3D for free. This is a pack of super useful 3D shapes that you can add to any video and take your visuals up a notch. Just click right here or the link in the description. And of course, ResolveCon would not be possible without Blackmagic Design. They just came out with the full release of DaVinci Resolve 19. For editing, color, effects, and audio, it's pretty much everything you need to make any kind of project in DaVinci Resolve. You can download DaVinci Resolve 19 right here or in the link in the description. I'm so excited to have you here and for the people to absorb the wisdom that you give. Last year we had to just shoo people out of your session because they just loved it so much. And so we have, just because there are other people here, guys, we're going to have to cut Daria off at some point. Okay. So nobody mob her or anything like that. But Daria, what are you talking about today?
So today we're going to look at the color grading lessons that we can learn from classic films, both old and modern.
That's so exciting. Well, I won't delay this any longer. Guys, give it up for Daria Fissoun.
I can hear your thunderous applause. Thank you so much for having me. Welcome everyone to ResolveCon, or day one. It's going swimmingly, I think. So yeah, today I would like to be a little less tech heavy for once and actually lean into the creative side of color grading and specifically like analyzing film and seeing what we can learn from those practices. Right. So oftentimes, I don't know about you, but I'll be grading something, and even though the footage was, quite nice when it came in, very clean and well shot, I still feel like it's missing like a certain something. I feel like it needs a bit of touch of that special filmic look that we're always chasing. And today's session is all about like identifying the elements of film and how they can translate to our grading practices. I also kind of put this together because oftentimes like the direction that we get from clients can be quite limited, so they will say something like, we want it to look like film without really getting into too much detail. So I thought maybe if I point out a few things, then, that will give you something to work towards. So I've got like 4 different elements I'm looking at today. I'm going to start with shadows. And this has already been color managed, right? So it's in Rec 709 color space, and the colors are otherwise untouched. So let me show you full screen. And let's say, for argument's sake, the first thing I want to do is sort out the contrast in this image, right? So really establish the shadows. I'm going to use my master wheels for this, right? So I'm going to drag down. There it is, my luminance. So I'm making it like really gritty. I know that it's an action film, it's a heist, right? These are the security guards. That's all the client has given me. And I'm thinking like, okay, well, just like, introduce high contrast. That's always good, right? But then when I look back at it, it still kind of feels digital. I mean, it is better, right? It is higher contrast, but there's something about it that just feels like inherently like digital video, right? So this is where I want to take a pause and review some classic films and really look at the shadows, right? Really study what's happening over there. So I'm going to jump to the start of my timeline. And in the bottom right corner of all these, you'll see the lower thirds. So you'll see the name of the film, the year, directors, colorists or color timers, or depending on the year that it was captured. And also where possible, I've included information about like the film stock and resolution. In this case, this was the colorists behind the 2007 restoration. I think it was primarily Jill Bogdanovich, but I also included people like color timers and DITs. Anyway, so let's start with the image itself. We have obviously like quite like a good contrasted image with very nice deep shadows, right? Got another one here also from Blade Runner. Again, very, very deep shadows, right? But they don't feel like the shadows that I just created, right? So there's something about them that's a little different, and we'll see it when we study the waveform, right? So I'm gonna pop out my scopes and see if you can spot what's unique about these shadows, right? Despite how deep they are, they're also quite elevated, right? There's almost like a little step up off the black point line or the 0 point line, right? And even though they are quite elevated, they still look nice and deep in the viewer. Now the second shot goes a little bit further down, but still there is a little bit of separation, right? So there is no clipping. It gives us this nice sort of protected shadow feature. If we look at a more modern film, I was still captured on film stock. Again, look how elevated those shadows are, right? And this is something you'll see again and again with film is that it doesn't really clip. And physically, that's not really possible for film, right? Because of the way that it captures light. As long as there's any amount of light entering the lens, there's always going to be detail, right, captured on the film. And you're going to be watching this in a cinema traditionally. So there's usually like around 48 nits dynamic range. Your eyes are going to be acclimated to the darkness. So even in these shadowy areas, you're going to see a lot of information, right? So when we work digitally, we kind of have, this new approach to treating pixel data. We have the ability to crush it and clip it if we wanted to, but it shouldn't really be what we're doing if we want to emulate the appearance and feel of film. Right. So in fact, here you can see, even though it kind of looks like it's all been crushed, across like the single flat line, there are still elements that extend even beyond that line. So you see Uma Thurman's hair actually technically is darker than John Travolta's suit, which I find is very interesting. If we keep going, so it's an older film here. And again, it all seems to be kind of hovering above this black point line, right? All seems to be pretty compressed, but the detail is still there, believe it or not, right? So I know these all look like blocks of black pixels, and I think we are at a slight disadvantage because we are all watching this back right now on digital displays. But if I was to lift, right, to the bottom of this image a little bit, look how much information it reveals, right? There's panels on this desk, there's panels on the wall, right? There's like a sort of like something draped over the piano in the back, right? So these were all revealed from the details that we find finding in the shadows. And sorry, hiding in the shadows. And if we use something like log wheels, for example, we could extend those further and find more information hiding in there, maybe even some wood grain. So this is something that I find all like old film stills, even ones that have been digitized, are going to reveal. Same thing here. So got Shaft, 1971. And again, the shadows look pretty dark, right? So it's right across the bottom of that black point. But if I raise the image, if I elevate those shadows, look, you can actually see that light and the street light standing out against the background, the people behind it. Same thing here. There's a street light. You can see some detail in this area here, right? Which you couldn't really do with digital film if you were simply crushing the data. All right, final one here I have is Truman Show. And again, look how dark this pullover is, right? And all the sort of information in the back. I drag this up, hey presto, suddenly there's like a t-shirt underneath, and then something underneath that. You can even see the texture in the sweater. So a lot of information hiding in there. Like I said, it's inherent to stock or, celluloid film. It can always be found. And then really like how far it extends within the digital waveform is kind of at the discretion of the finishing artist who would have digitized these films, when they were being prepared for digital deliverables like DVD sales or streaming services, stuff like that. But we can always still find that, like fine roll off. Now with modern films, right, you can see they've continued this practice, right, of keeping shadows non-clipped. So for example, to me, to my eyes, this looks like a complete silhouette, right? But when we look at the signal, there's a lot of information still hiding in there, and we're going to see this in the cinema in the dark. Same thing for Arrival. You might be thinking like, yeah, but this is all black, right? It's just a black solid behind her. But I can elevate this. Look at that. There's like information here. There's a structure. There's a room. All right, keep going with June. Still elevated. I'm not really pointing out the waveform anymore, but hopefully you're all noticing how everything is just sort of hovering above that bottom line. Let me lift it up again. Boom, there's an entire room, right? An entire set behind them. And same thing for Nope, one of my favorites. So a lot of Nope takes place at night in the dark, and you can still always see everything because all that information is still retained. All right, so when we come back to this example shot, I started off the demo by crushing the shadows using the lift master wheel, right, and dragging the gain up a bit to give myself contrast. And you can see we're kind of breaking the image by clipping it at the bottom. I will say, I think a lot of people, when they first learn how to color grade, learn it in this manner. I was learning like 15 years ago in film school, and that was like the first thing they showed us. To create contrast, you want to clip, the waveform against like the floor of the waveform. And I know now that's probably not best practice unless you want it to sort of look like this. So let me get rid of my scopes for a second and show you what you could do. There's a few different approaches to this. There's not like one solution, but I'll show you a couple since we have time for those. So one thing I could do, let me label this contrast, is we can create a dedicated node that's just going to be there to elevate our trace in the scope and protect that shadow data. So like I said, a few ways to accomplish this. Very simple way is by using the soft clip in the curves palette. Right, so you can find these in the bottom right corner. Now you have the low clip, which is the more extreme version of the tool. I'll show you what it looks like. If I drag it up, you can see that it pretty much redefines what the black point of the signal is. And it's pretty destructive, right? So it will clip the bottom of the waveform. And it's kind of interesting because it produces the look of magnetic tape to my eyes, or maybe like very underexposed celluloid that didn't capture any detail, right? So you can see it's got that flatness, which sometimes for aesthetic purposes, that might be what you were looking for, right? So that's why I'm showing it to you, because it is a choice. But if we're talking about, retention of detail, we probably want to focus on low soft, which will do something similar, except it will actually pick up the bottom of the trace, right, and elevate it, rolling off the details at the bottom, right? So there's that retention of information without loss. Right, so now I show you before and after. So this is with just the contrast. This is with that low soft applied, and you can see details again, right? So in the clothes, under the desk, right? So this is my original image, and this is after both nodes are applied, with and without that roll off. And we've still retained that same strong contrast, but we've now emulated the feel of like film shadows, right? Which is what I encourage people to do. Right, so I think that's good for our first element. Anything I'm forgetting? Oh, I did say there's a few ways to do this. Let me show you one more approach. So I'm gonna, well, actually, in fact, I'll make two notes. So you've noticed that I've added the low soft at the end of my pipeline. And this will continue to work. Like I made it second, but I could also have made it before I created my contrast, right? And kind of have that bottom of the trace locked into place at this elevation. However, you'll have varying degrees of success with this workflow based on like how you're targeting the shadows. So if you use any tools that are mapped to the black point of like the video signal, then they're probably going to break your low soft, right? So when I say mapped to the black point, that's usually the lift or the curves black point over here. If I drag the lift downwards, you can see that I can still clip that signal, right? Because it is mapped like all the way to that point. But if I was working with contrast, you can see the contrast will continue to respect that soft clip, right? And if you knew exactly where your middle gray or your pivot point should be, then you could set it up to like match your source camera footage and get some pretty good contrast that's like appropriate for your footage setup. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, if you're using color management, then that, with that, you can also set up like how you want the shadows to roll off, and you can have it ingrained into your deliverables so that you can build up your like your color grade prior to that in earlier stages of the pipeline. So two ways to go about it. And then one last thing is you could also use the HDR palette, right? And this was designed concurrently with the DaVinci wide gamut, right? So if you're using color management, this will work especially well. This project is not color managed, right? I just kept it really simple. But yeah, if you do have color management enabled, you can use your standard HDR tonal wheels to create contrast. So let's say I'm going to use shadow and light. So I'm going to drag down shadow, drag up light, create contrast, and then use the black offset, which is the equivalent of the low soft in the HDR panel, except the roll-off is even gentler, right? I find that it retains information a bit more successfully, and it's a less aggressive tool. Like I find that you can't lift it as high. So, but I think it's about as high as you want to take it in this case. So yeah, let me expand this, show before and after, and it's pretty much a similar result. Because I used the tonal wheels, I was able to like also control how the contrast was impacted. I could also do this with the contrast tool in the HDR palette, but it will retain equal saturation throughout. So that will produce a different result. So like I said, there's lots and lots of different approaches, but the two main ones to keep in mind is low soft and the black offset in the HDR palette, if that's what you're using. All right, let's look at another element. For this one, we're going to talk about film stock, right? So Something that, we talk a lot about in creating film looks is, we discuss the colors that we introduce into a project in order to give it like its feel, right, or stylization, right? But what we don't consider as much is that this type of stylization was not really inherent, or sorry, it wasn't really sort of forced on like older films as much because it was inherent to the celluloid stock itself, right? So there was a lot of different stock types, and filmmakers would actually shop around and they would experiment with what they would, eventually go on to shoot a film with, right? So in the same way that you do costume tests or makeup tests, you would, test what stock or what negative stock you would shoot on, and then eventually also what release print stock you would print it on. And both of these things would impact how the highlights appeared, how the shadows appeared, right? So color dominance in both, and also general like contrast and capture of detail. So that's, that and color timing all informed, how the colors of the film came out, aside from like set design, of course, and all those things. With digital post-production, we have way like far more control over these elements than ever before, right? But not just on a primary level, but also on a secondary. So we can emulate a lot of these looks artificially. But what I think, what kind of behoves us to do is to sometimes study the appearance and behavior of these old stocks in order to understand what we're trying to actually recreate in post. Right. So I've got shot from The Godfather. And I mean, this isn't a particularly dynamic scene, that one in the barber shop where someone's getting a shave. But the reason I picked it is because I feel like the colors, are just perfect for demonstrating, what the stock is doing to the image, right? So we're getting like cyan in the highlights. We're getting a lot of like purple or sorry, magenta or red in the shadows. It's very obvious in this shot. Right. We also have the French connection. We've got like a gentle cyan in the gamma range, right? Lower midtones. So that's also impacting the overall feel of the film. People even picked film stock based on like the genre, right? You wouldn't shoot like a comedy on the same type of film stock that you would have used for a horror film or an action sequence. So as we move on, right, we start to transition from celluloid to imitating it with digital means. Some got like a really recent film as well, right? So look at those elevated shadows again. This is what I was talking about earlier, right? And this is especially like good for also showing like flashbacks, right? So emulating like retro looks, retro colors, right? And then of course we've got very modern films that are also giving us that treatment. So how do we study film stock and how do we emulate it? So first of all, you can actually get your hands on a lot of film stock emulators yourself. Like people will sell lookup tables that you can use or DCTLs. In fact, DaVinci Resolve, if you have it installed, does come with like a small subfolder of film look LUTs that you can find in the LUTs panel within the LUTs folder. So there it is, film looks. And here you can see that the conversion, so the color mapping, right, is from that first state, right, to the second. So in this case, we can map from Rec 709, which is what this project currently is, to say like a Kodak stock. And D65 is probably the most common like white point for deliverables right now. So I can click and drag that onto my pipeline, and you can see that's immediately been applied. And that gives us an opportunity to look at what kind of contrast, right, the film stock would have had, and also the type of colors that are applied, right? So you can see that in the gamma range, we have a nice blue. So you could recreate that. You could, if you didn't want to use a LUT for any reason, you could maybe wipe this gradient and try to recreate exactly this tone curve and push colors into the image, and then sort of reuse it as, a color node on other clips in your timeline. Aside from using LUTs, there's also a few plugins you can get that also sort of emulate or attempt to emulate film stock. So one that I really like is Enhancer. And they like publish updates for this. Like it feels like on a weekly basis, I get an email. Once you apply it, like usually comes with all these bells and whistles, including like halation and bloom and grain. But I just want to focus on like the film profiles that they give you here. So you can click and you can see there's a lot of film stocks represented. You've got Agfa, you got Fujifilm, Fuji Color Kodaks. And you can switch between these and just study like what's happening to the waveform, right? See what's happening to the colors. You can see they're all unique in their own way. And then another one I thought would be worth showing as well that's in the same kind of arena is Look Designer. Drag that in. And what I like about this one is that it gives you both negative stock options and print stock options as well. So there's, again, a lot of things that you can sort of look through and study. Some of these are quite subtle, but there we go. So you can see some of the colors popping. And again, it's really nice. It gradiates, right, from shadows to midtones to highlights. And that really gives you an idea of what you should be doing in the primaries wheels to emulate that. All right, but what if you don't have LUTs and you don't have these fancy plugins, right? What can you do on your own when studying classic film images, right? I can show you a trick. Let me get rid of the effects. And that is to kind of like reverse engineer the look yourself to understand what the colorist would have had to have done on their end, right? By essentially balancing the image. And a really quick way to accomplish that is by using the pick black point and pick white point tools in the primaries. So these are the little like crosshairs that you see in the upper left corner of the lift and gain wheels. So what you want to do is basically find neutral elements in the frame. So ideally a shadow and the highlights. So ideally like a purely black object and a white object, and click on them with these crosshairs. And now oftentimes that's impossible. You're not going to have like pure black or pure white in the image. So you kind of have to find the closest thing that you expect to be neutral, right? So for shadows, for example, we usually go for just like the darkest element I can find in a shot, and a place that I could relatively assume wouldn't have too much color or too much light, in it. So for example, usually like the cuffs of clothing or like underneath like people's hats. So I'm going to use this crosshair, click on it here, click right underneath here. And if there was any artificial color added to the shadows, it would have been picked up by this region, and it is now being sort of reversed or color corrected by this lift crosshair. Now for the whites, it can be even harder because, again, like I always, have this example of a white piece of paper, like, an A4 print paper or a white t-shirt, which are great for balancing. But oftentimes these are not visible in a shot. So I will sort of assume that this was an overcast day, right? And I will use the sky, right, as pure white. So I'm going to select my gain crosshair. You can see that as soon as I click it, it picks up the crosshair. I'm going to click in the sky. Now, hang on. I know it looks really neutral right now, but it is also overexposed. And in fact, the shadows are also clipped because whenever you click on something with these crosshairs, you are basically assigning that pixel value as pure black, right? So RGB value of 000, or pure white, which is an RGB value of 1023, 1023, etc. If you're in a 10-bit system. So you're still going to have to pull back, right, on the luminance of the image to kind of restore the spread of the trace. But the colors, right, are still going to be like retained, right? The color correction that you applied. And that's what the most important thing is. In fact, if I disable this node, I'm going to keep an eye on my scopes and just make sure that the spread is correct. So it should be about 896 for highlights and about halfway from 0 to 128 for the shadows. So yeah, I'm just going to pick those up. Those are a bit low. Okay, cool. So now you can see that's a before and that's an after. This is the correction that I've just made, based purely on what I thought would be a good black point reference and a good white point. And this gives us some idea of like what the environment may have looked like on the day that it was captured, right? Which means that this is all post-production. And I can evaluate it by eye, right? I can tell that obviously there's a lot of yellow being introduced into the sky relative to what we see in this corrected version. But it's a little harder to see what's happening in the shadows. So something else that you might do is go into your vector scope and study what's happening over there. Right. So popped out my vector scope. Here we go. And yeah, I'm just going to leave it with the same settings that it comes with. Yeah, no zooming in. But if I want to study what's happening like in the upper and lower ranges, right, of that trace, I can change my setting from all to low, and now I'm only looking at the shadows of my image, what's classified as a shadow, right? And by enabling and disabling this, my node, I can see where the trace is jumping in order to neutralize those colors, right? So I can tell that it started off somewhere towards like a a greenish cyan, right? And it had to be pulled towards a reddish magenta in order to be neutralized. If we look in the highlights, all right, you can see it's moving in a slightly different direction, right? So the trace started off more in the yellow direction here, and then it had to move closer to like a bluish magenta in order to get neutralized, right? So this is giving me two directions that my color wheels have to go in order to emulate this look, right? Now you could just, without color correcting the image, you could have just started like this, but sometimes depending on the content of the shot, this can be a little difficult to read. So with that correction, seeing that motion is what can help you kind of orient where you need to be to emulate or copy a certain look. So let me get out of here, out of my scopes. And we're going to try to get this sea lion into 1917. I feel there was a real lack of sea lions in that film, so we're going to correct that. Let's see. I've got a blank note here. Again, this is color managed already, so I don't have to worry about that. But in order to emulate the look, what did we establish, right? So we had shadows, which we need to move towards like a greenish cyan. So let me go over here to the lift. And I can even use my arrow keys to jump up and down and see exactly where the point has been maneuvered. So I know that I have to sort of move it in the opposite direction. It's a very mild adjustment, right? So I just have to move it like about yay far. A bit more cyan. There we go. And then the same thing for the highlights. Double check where we're going. See where that point has moved. And that's pretty much horizontal towards blue, which means I want to move horizontally towards yellow. All right, and we're getting there. Look at that. There's just a couple of motions, and it's got us most of the way there. But I'm also going to right-click on the clip, the 1917 clip, and I'm going to wipe it in my timeline, right, so I can compare these side by side, because I feel like the luminance is probably not matched at all. So I'm going to go back to my waveform. There it is. You can see that's quite elevated. So I'm going to use my gain master wheel to drag that down, match it up to the 1917 clip. Then this will also reveal any like saturation differences. So I feel maybe there's a touch too much saturation on the left. But I think now I'm just getting a bit pedantic. I think that's pretty close, actually. That's a good match. All right, and also keep an eye on the shadows and kind of go back and forth. And I feel, I am now, that I've seen it, I'm picking up the blue and the cyan that's hiding in the shadows. It's just super, super subtle. Right? But you can kind of see it in these elements. All right, and anything I do beyond this, now that I've got my match or my look, it's just building on top of the shot, So I'd like for the sea lion to stand out a bit more. He's sort of disappearing into the rocks behind him. So I'm going to use the magic mask to select him and grade him separately. And for that, I'm going to use a separate corrector node. Right, so I'm going to feed the RGB data from the source input into this node, sea lion. All right, then I'm going to click and drag to make a selection. And in case you're wondering, like, well, why am I doing this in a separate node? Why not just do it in node number 2? I could do that. But the magic mask is very reactive to any changes that occur across the node pipeline. So if I started making other grading changes, I would have to retrack the magic mask. By performing it in a dedicated separate branch, I can just perform the track the one time and then reuse the key data that's generated as many times as I like down the pipeline. So I made my selection. I'm going to perform a track. There we go. Perfect. Turn off my mask overlay, connect the key to node number 2. And I should have called that mask bad practice. So I have to fix it. There we go. Perfect. So now I can just do whatever needs to be done, maybe a bit of gamma to brighten them up, a bit of contrast to make them stand out, maybe a bit of saturation. Ooh. Maybe make him a bit more red. There we go. Mid-tone detail. Anyway, just at this point, just having fun with it. All right, it's before and after, make him stand out, and I can play it back. Perfect. I remember this scene in 1917, don't you? I do. All right, so I pretty much used the same technique to look at Solaris, for example, and recreate that in a different shot. This was on some raw media. before and after, and again, just emulating the highlights by first balancing the shot before I applied the look. And it does feel like at first I thought it was like it must be magenta fog, but you could see it in like the highlights of the image, right, in the white flowers as well. So that's how I knew it was part of the stock itself. And yeah, got to recreate that. So, all right, that was number 2. Let's keep going. Number 3, we're going to talk about color density, right? That's also something that's very special to film. And I think like a good way to describe color density and how it stands out from like um, sort of lower quality hardware. Like, I don't know a good way to phrase it, but think about television, right? Nowadays, like we refer to a lot of productions as being prestige television, like the era of prestige television since like the 2000s. But prior to the 2000s, when we talked about television, people sort of implied it's something that was sort of low quality, right? And that is because the equipment and the capture methods, used back then were not like the ones that we use now, which emulate more like film workflows, right? So usually the production values are much higher nowadays, the quality of the script, and color grading tends to emulate like film grading. But back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you tended to have something that came, straight out of the camera that had like DIT work, but not that level of like color timing applied to it. And something you would notice always on television is that the colors looked really vibrant, right? Like almost to the point of looking garish. So we would have these issues called like color blooming, or not even color blooming, but just regular blooming, right? So like highlights and upper luminance. And also color bleeding, which is where if you had a very saturated color like red or green, you tended to see like a little bit of almost like a chromatic glow or like a fuzz around it, so it looked like it was bleeding into the surrounding area. Right, and it's not something that you typically see in celluloid film, right? The colors tend to be a lot more like contained, right, and more like purposeful or dense, right? So density can be described as like a feature that in which colors are highly saturated, but also low in luminance, right? It creates this really nice deep look. So this is a good example of color density, right? Especially in the blues. If you're capturing this like daylight or like a blue sky on your phone or in a camcorder, it tends to come out like a very bright, like almost neon blue. But if we're looking cinematically, and I know that this is a composited shot and there's like artificial, like secondary grading introduced, but it's still in keeping with like sort of celluloid colors, right? So looking at this image, right, looks like it's got a broad range of colors and also contrast, right? It feels like a high contrast image. But when we look at the waveform, it's actually pretty dense, right? It's all mostly contained within the midtones. So if I hover over these areas with my mouse, and hopefully you can see my indicator, right, my qualifier, when I do this, right, see where the sky is falling? It's in the bottom half of this trace, right? So excusing like these super dark elements, which are the writers, right? And then if you look at the ground, surprisingly, it's brighter than the sky, right? Which we wouldn't sort of anticipate in real life. We always expect the sky to be brighter. But in this case, it's the exact reverse. That's a good example of density in the blues. Right. What about the red in this image? If you could just look at the red outfit the character is wearing, where would you anticipate that to appear in the waveform if you had to guess? Right. I'll even show you what the waveform for this image looks like. Right. Where do we think that is? Now, when I looked at it, I assumed it was going to be somewhere in the midtones, probably lower midtones, right? Because it's deep red. Right. So I was figuring here. I thought maybe this shape might be it. But then I hover over it with my mouse and look at that. I'm not even on the shadows, right? I'm just on the brightest part of the red, and it's in the bottom 10% of the image, right? That's how dense that red is, right? And this is really, really typical of film, is that it does tend to have these very lush, very deep reds. Right, so we're back to Shaft. Again, if you had to guess, even without looking at the waveform, like how bright do you think the walls behind them are? For me, this almost looks like a silhouette image, right? Because it feels like the walls are so much brighter than everything else in the shot. Then you hover over them, right, with a qualifier, and they're all also within like the bottom 10% of the image, right? And it's kind of hard to wrap your head around because we expect like vibrant colors to also be bright, and they are, right, in digital video or in like broadcast video, but not so much in celluloid. Right. So it's not just red, right? I've got some blue examples as well, bottom 10%, right? Even when it's a little lighter, like so, it's still very dense, right? So what can we learn from that when we're grading? Let me bring my node down so you can see what we're doing. I've got this shot here, and that looks already pretty tremendous, right? There's not much you need to do to this. But let's say I wanted to make it look filmic, right? Like if it was part of like a film sequence. One thing I can do is work on the density, and there's several tools that will accomplish this. I'll show you some of them. Let's start with a classic, right? So sticking to the curves, we're going to go for hue versus loom, right? And I'm just going to pick a point in his coat, and I'm going to drag it down to darken that region, right? So introducing darkness, but remember density is not just darkness, it's saturation as well. So I could use hue versus sat to accomplish that, or I can even use the color warper. Right? That will do something similar, but it allows me to control both saturation and hue at the same time. So I'm going to check my resolution here. I've got only 6 columns. I'm going to go to 12. Let me pop that out and bring it to this screen. Okay, so you just click over here and drag outwards. That will saturate that coat, and then moving it left and right will allow me to rotate between like slightly different hues. Maybe I want to go a little warmer, right, rather than a red coat, like so. And there it is. Now I've got really dense color on that animal. And then, if I wanted to keep playing around with this look, I might want to sort of create a split tone effect by pushing blue or cyan into like the midtones and the shadows. So let me go to my lift, and I'm going to switch over to the bars and drag my red channel downwards, right? So the opposite of red is cyan. So it's going to introduce a bit of color into those elements, but it's also pushing color into the shadows, like on the Highland cow himself, right? So you can see that's before the blue and after the blue. And that's before the grade overall, and this is after the grade. Right, so with just a couple of tools, a couple of touches, I was able to create something a bit more interesting with the colors. But it's always easy to do when you have beautiful footage, of course. Let's keep going. So a couple of other tools I want to show you is very recently introduced to DaVinci Resolve 19. We also have the color slice. So you have the ability to actually directly affect density. So that's what the parameter is called, density. And there's also one for subtractive saturation, which also emulates the behavior of color in celluloid film. So here, go to the red channel vector, push that up. Right, and again, with just a single motion, I can go from that sort of video red to a more film red. You can affect like what element, right, of the shot you're impacting by using the center parameter here. Right, so you can drag left and right in case you're trying to make a change and it's not really grabbing like the element because it's slightly too warm or too cool. Right? You can still fix that with the center, but it does tend to be pretty compartmentalized, right? So it is kind of fixed to the selection. So if you find that you can't use color slice without like compromising, you can still do some really good things using like older and more classic tools, right? So if you go in the color menu, I still very frequently use my presets here. So 6 vectors, I use red. And what's great about these is that, I don't know if we have time to really get into it. Let me show you real quick what that looks like. So presets, red is basically just a qualifier selection, but it's fully modifiable in the same way that a qualifier is. So then, if I want to exclude something or include it, I can do so here. There we go, and redefine it. And once that's properly set up for my shot, then I can still return to the color slice and use something like global density instead, right, and still get the effect that I want. And then finally, since we're all about giving a shout out to our favorite plugins, I'm also going to mention mono nodes, which I absolutely love. Right, they target pretty much every aspect of the image that you can think of. Right, so you've got color shifts, got hue twists. So yeah, affecting saturation, luminance. But I, in particular, want to show you density. Right, so density T and just regular density is a couple of tools. So it's a DCTL, but I've saved these as presets in my gallery. But if you open it up, you can see there's a lot of tools to choose from. And here you can affect the density of a single channel. And I find the application is a bit broader, right? So you tend to get like a better, like maybe primary application in certain instances, right? I think it's good that we have both of these tools because you can really pick and choose what you need for any particular scenario. So then I can play it back. And right, I just want to show you how much it's changed the image, right? I've just reduced the density a little bit, but look at how intense like the gamut of that blue used to be, right? It feels like by reducing by increasing density, we're actually reintroducing detail back into the shot, right? So I can actually see more of her face, right? I can see the outline of her nose against her cheek better after we use density to adjust the blue, right? And again, this is another good example of, something coming in that you want to make look like film that doesn't quite look like film. And I think this is one of those examples, is like oversaturated primary colors, right? And we can use density to tone those down, right? And then you combine that with the other things that I showed you, right? The shadows and like film stock emulation, and you can really work your way up to making more filmic looks. And then the final thing we have that I wanted to talk about is also highlights. This is more of a pep talk than anything. And the reason I wanted to, I'm not going to talk about like overexposure or anything too like advanced, right, in terms of like color managing your image. I actually want to take a step back and maybe encourage you to embrace like mistakes or bad habits, as it were. So anyway, let me start again. What I'm really saying is that a lot of trainers and tutorials, myself included, like we tend to focus a lot on like fixing overexposure, right? We always bring it up as an issue, and we're always saying like, okay, well, let me show you how to fix that. Here's all these tools that you can use. This is how you can bring back information. And I think it sets a lot of like young colorists, on this trajectory that anytime they see overexposure, it's an issue that needs to be fixed. And I'm here to say like, that's not always the case. Sometimes you want to just work with the overexposure and integrate that into your final look. So I'm going to show you some images of some truly fantastic films, all of which embraced overexposed elements. All right, so look at that, Coen Brothers, boom, window. There's no detail here, right? I mean, it is actually pretty like soft this exposure, and it has been rolled down, right, so that it's practically like in the diffused light area, but it's still just two straight lines, right? So it is an overexposed window, but that's fine because that's not what the audience is watching, right? They're watching the performance. And I think that's something we tend to forget sometimes when we color grade. We're so fixated on making every corner of the frame and the room look perfect that we fail to follow the audience's eye. This is why it's important to grade, quickly. People have like this workflow where they're only looking at a shot for a few seconds before they make their decision and then they move on. And that means that, when you first open the shot, you will know where your eye is traveling to naturally, and you get to work on that first. And usually it's always going to be people or whatever the subject of the shot is. Right. So there's one window, there's another window, very similar shot, and this is also from Nope. And again, there are elements outside here. You can see a structure, right? But the sky itself is pretty overexposed. Right? This is done again and again and again in films. In this case, we're taking advantage of these blown out windows to give the room an ethereal look, right? So this is clearly done with intention. Or in this case, right? Again, who's looking at the windows when Cillian Murphy is delivering a monologue? No one, right? So all eyes are here. No one cares about the windows. But again, the windows themselves are part of the stylistic choice. And in fact, in a lot of productions, it's very risky to rely on natural light or natural exteriors, right? Because those are going to change. They're going to fluctuate not just from one day to the next, but from 1 hour to the next, right? Depending on cloud coverage, depending on weather in general. So it's actually safer to set up artificial lighting outside the windows. And that lighting tends to be things like Kino flows or, just like RE redheads or something like that, super bright lights that are there to blow out the window. And it's perfectly fine. This is the final film that was delivered. And I say this knowing that Oppenheimer was shot for like IMAX, right? So it is an extremely like high dynamic range movie. But regardless, right, it had an SDR deliverable, right? For the average viewer at home, right, SDR screen or computer, they are still watching it within a 100 nit range, right? And this is that deliverable, right? Still overexposed and exactly what we need. On top of windows and skies and things like that, you've also got the fact that you've got light sources in your shots sometimes, and we want to retain those. Like, why would you want to bring down a light source, right? It needs to look bright. It needs to be overexposed, right? So we're retaining that. Fires, light bulbs, lampposts, it's all fine. This doesn't need to be protected, right? We don't want to compromise the content of a shot to benefit like some lights in the background or some windows, right? Always the subjects take priority. Or in the case of Kill Bill Volume 2, can be used stylistically. So Quentin Tarantino is famously a huge fan of martial arts films. So in this sequence, this training sequence, he purposely went for a look that emulated, right, these older films, right? And it's very blown out, very overexposed, but it's done with intention, right? It's a good example of knowing the rules and breaking them because you know them, right? Blown out skies, even in recent productions, we embrace those. It's perfectly fine. Overcast, no problem. Push some light into it, it's fine, right? So I think we're about a minute away from wrapping. Look at that, completely overexposed. So this is already color managed. All I need to do, right, bring it down to like a diffuse area somewhere right here. Push a bit of light. If we're going for like a golden hour look, otherwise, might discuss with the client what they want. I mean, sometimes, if the other footage from this shot, like from the sequence or from the shoot, did have blue skies, then obviously we would do sky replacement. That's not a problem. I'm not trying to urge you to be lazy, but I'm trying, encouraging everyone to be more objective about, what exposure or overexposure really is, and when it's a good idea to just embrace it, right? Versus trying to like protect the speculars or whatever is like hitting the top like of your ceiling and your scopes. So I think that was Casey. That was perfectly on time.
Oh man, you crushed it. It was like to the minute.
I know.
That's amazing. Daria, this was so interesting. And I half the time I was just like just in awe. Like just like, wow, I've never thought about that before. I got to change how I do things. So informative, so wonderful as usual. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. By the way,
Of course.
I had a lot of fun.
Yeah. So we do have a few questions here. We're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. There were a lot. Everybody wants to pick your brain, Daria, but we're going to get to a few of them. Okay. So in no particular order, this is from Rody. Is that how you say it? Why do people use CST to convert to DaVinci Wide Gamut? How does it help?
I mean, there's no particular reason. I could have used. I personally prefer to use project-wide color management, so I prefer to set it up here. But yeah, some people just have a preference. Like I've heard it explained that they prefer to remap like specific cameras, but you can do that with project-wide color management as well because you can always override the input color space on an individual clip. And as long as you're using like a rippling action, right, with your nodes,
Yeah,
then it should work on. Where's my rippling? It's somewhere here. Then yeah, you could still sort of copy that behavior across all your clips, and you could still use aces. So yeah, there's no like absolute right or wrong way to do things.
yeah. I'm wondering if it's more like why use DaVinci Wide Gamut in general? Like what's the
Oh,
point of that?
well, the reason why I was bringing up DaVinci Wide Gamut, I could have been talking about ARRI Wide Gamut as well, or like ACES, AP0 or AP1. The reason why we really love those gamuts is because, as the name implies, they're very wide, which means that they can encapsulate all other deliverable standards that we're currently working with.
Mm.
So right now, Rec 709 is what this monitor is, and most monitors. Or like, well, a Mac will be like a P3, so it'll be substantially bigger. But let me show you like another, where's the gamut? DaVinci Wide Gamut, boop, 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 boop. There it is. See how much bigger that triangle is, right? So that's your primaries, red, green, and blue. From this bigger triangle, you can map down to any other standard, whether it's broadcast television, high dynamic range television, streaming, cinema, etc.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Here's a question. How do you color grade a video that's already in Rec 709 in the first place? That's kind of a big question, but a couple tips maybe.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, if you're working with like masters, for example, master vendors, like they will oftentimes be Rec 709. And you still sort of follow the same rules as you would for standard grading, right? So you're keeping an eye on the distribution of the trace and the scopes. You're Like there will be limitations, right? Because the benefit of capturing footage with a log encoded signal or with RAW is that you have far more latitude for color grading, right? And for working with luminance. But you still work with Rec 709 the same way, just keeping in mind that you don't have that latitude, so you kind
Yeah.
of have to, be more maybe careful and more conservative with your adjustments.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Next question. Do you have Ansel Adams' zone system in mind when you color grade, like middle gray for dark
Ooh.
skin tones, V1 to
It's
V2 for lighter skin tones, etc.?
6 to 7 for lighter skin
Oh,
tones.
6 to 7. Okay.
Yeah.
I know stuff. Don't worry.
So it's funny you should mention Ansel Adams. I was going to bring him up on Saturday, which is when I'm doing my next session. Whew, it's a good
Ooh,
little
that's a
opportunity.
plug. Yeah, and
And
you don't
plug
get to
in.
know unless you're a cool kid and you get the VIP. So how about
Yeah,
that?
so I'll talk a little bit about that and about false colors and all that. Yeah, using that to assist with luminance and skin tone grading. Yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
great. All right. Next question. Do you think the teal orange color theme is overrated? Do you decide on the color theme? How do you decide on a color theme for the project? And do you try to use the same color theme throughout a project or scene by scene?
Well, 3 questions.
That's like 3 questions. All right.
Yeah.
Like, or come on.
I mean, I think teal orange is fine. Like it makes sense that it's popular is because, orange is pretty much where everyone's skin tone is and teal is its opposite. So it's always going to produce an attractive image. I think we've just in recent years colorists have reined it in and they've started using it more like like it's more gentle, it's like more with purpose. But I guess like I don't know if I have teal orange in front of me, but it's kind of everywhere when you think about it. Um yeah.
Who designs stuff with teal and orange? That's really weird.
I love the color scheme this year. And also deciding colors like really should be happening with the cinematographer and the director. So it should definitely be a conversation. And yeah, we're usually designing it ideally months, like usually before principal photography. But even if, like my clients come to me after like they've shot the film, there's still like a trial and error period where we're just deciding on the look.
Yeah,
And it is only with their like approval and their enthusiastic approval that we'll go forward with a look. It's
sure.
not something I spring on them.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Here's a question. With the growing prevalence of OLED and true blacks, are there new Sam's moving the thing around. I can't read. Are there new advantages in aiming for deeper blacks in color grading? Should colorists adjust their methods to optimize content for new displays? Ooh, that's a good
Ooh,
one.
so yes and no. I mean, truthfully, I'm not an expert on like an OLED, right, and those types of deliverables. But one thing I can tell you, right, is that like in an HDR system, right, or an OLED deliverable, the black point will still be the black point, right? Like the 0 point, like an RGB like pixel value of 000 is going to be the same across all displays, right? So I usually refer to this as like the hypothetical black point because it really comes down to like what you're viewing your image on. If I was watching this on a CRT television set, right? So that's an old television display, the ones with the big backs, right? So the cathode ray tubes. Uh, like the blackest black that it could achieve wasn't very dark, right? It was just a dark gray, if anything. So when the TV was off, it still looked kind of gray. And that's, I could play the same video signal on that display versus playing it on an HDR screen, and it would be the same signal, and they would both transmit, a pixel value of 0. It would just look different on those displays. So it's not like when we're grading like HDR that we have like some area beyond the 0 point line that we're extending the waveform towards. So I think the retention of detail in the shadows is still very relevant. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. All right. Can you explain what you mean when you say the image is already using color management?
Yeah. So when I was like doing all these examples, a lot of these like clips that I'm working on, they came in log encoded, or some of these clips are raw, and it's kind of like a very very big topic in its own. And I'm kind of acknowledging that I'm not touching that topic because that would be like another 3 hours. But let me see. Actually, I can't really turn this off because it's actually set up in the camera raw settings. If I set that to project, there we go. So that's what it looks like when it's not color managed. And I sort of acknowledged that I was already doing some of the heavy lifting in the background, either via like the raw settings or a CST, color space transform node. That's what I meant.
Yeah, we do have quite a bit of resources coming at you on color management. I believe we have a session on color management here tomorrow or the next day. So if you're confused with color management, welcome to the club. It is a confusing thing until you wrap your head around it. It took me a long time to really understood it, mostly from the help of Daria. So
And me too.
yeah, so you're not alone. Don't worry.
Yeah, I think being confused about color management is like the first step of understanding color management.
Yeah.
If you're feeling confident, something's gone wrong.
Yeah, you probably don't really know what you're talking about. When we have to grade or correct stock footage without log, is there a particular starting point? Should we try to make it look more log-like first and then go from there? Great question.
I think the first thing I would do is try to match the stock footage to the starting point of the rest of the footage on the timeline, right? So if I had rushes, from the production, I would match it to those post color management, right? So when it looks like Rec 709, like when it looks like human vision. But I wouldn't try to like make it look log because after you're sort of like doing 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, like you're sort of undoing something and then redoing it again, and that's usually bad practice because like over massaging the video signal usually leads to like artifacting and distortion, like compromisation, like in the shadows and the highlights. So you're better off like managing the signal as little as possible, right? And I would just have maybe one match node to get it to look like color managed, um, like footage from the remainder of the film, and then proceed with the rest of the grade.
Yeah, so it would be, so it's not like transforming all of your Rec 709 footage into, C-Log or something before, if everything else is C-Log.
No, I wouldn't do that because then you're sort of artificially like creating a log curve. I've not even tried to do that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think there'd be a big advantage to that other than if you're doing some look over everything, it might be less work to match them all when you change the look or you change the output, possibly. But let's do work now or do work later. And I think it's wise to not mess with the image as much as possible if it's already baked in Rec 709.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for. So thank you so much, Daria. This has been so great, guys. Yeah, post some emotes in the chat and give Daria a hand. This has been so great. Thank you so much, Daria.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun.